Welcome back to another edition of Coffee and Contracts. I am your host, Rusty Whitten of Carr in Memphis, Tennessee. And today I am stoked, man. I have an absolute stud in the game here with me today, Heinrich Cronje from Houston, Texas. Heinrich came in my training class. We were in Denver together back in August. I'm super excited to pick your brain today, Heinrich. Got a lot to learn from you, man. How's it going in Houston? How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thanks, man. I appreciate you having me on. Going well in Houston, just busy trying to close some deals. School's about to be out for my daughter, so we have about 1 week left of going hard, and then it's the summertime, so I'm sure it's going to be slowing down here in the next few weeks. So trying to close as many deals as we can and get ready for the time with the family.
That's it, man. Yeah, exactly. You've seen it because you've been in it for a while, which we'll get to that here in a minute. But there's those swings, and so you want to try to ride the momentum while you can, and then head to summer. Do y'all have any big summer plans? Anything fun coming up?
Yeah, we're actually going to go to Mexico in a couple of weeks.
Nice.
So the first week of summer, we're going to go to Mexico, and then my
Nice.
my wife is like the planner of the family. I call her the CEO, and so she's got so many things lined up: summer camps, a couple small trips here and there. But yeah, the biggest one we're gonna do is Mexico. So looking forward to that one. It's gonna be nice to kind of unplug and unwind, and then come back and be refreshed.
Yeah, exactly, man. We just got back. We're on the heels of our national meeting. We're recording this, and so you kind of got invigorated for that final push, and then it'll be nice to kind of push hard to Mexico, and then kick your feet up, have a cold beverage or two if that's your thing, and enjoy some sunshine, man. You definitely earned it.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Well, hey, man, I just want to get into your background a little bit. I know kind of your background. Unfortunately, I also know you went to Texas A&M, which is, I'm trying to overlook that as a Mississippi State grad myself, but kind of tell the folks a little bit about your background, kind of where you were before coming to Carr and kind of your story.
Yeah. So before Carr, I was at a bigger national real estate firm called Transwestern. So it's a full service real estate development, investment, and brokerage company. So, big shop. I was there for about 7 years doing landlord work, strictly landlord work. Did a couple tenant deals here and there, but for the most part, I just represented landlords and institutional landlords across the city of Houston and a little bit outside of Houston too. Before that, actually, an interesting story. I worked for a development company called Heinz. So no, I did not work for the ketchup company as my mom always thought. So Heinz was or is the largest, I believe it's the largest privately held development company in the world. So they build beautiful buildings. I mean, double A diamond office buildings. They do mixed use developments, so multifamily, retail. They've recently gotten into the life sciences aspect of real estate. So think about like guys running around in little lab coats with BSL 1 and 2 labs, so those types of things. So I actually worked for them for 2 years as an assistant property manager of the tallest building in the world outside of a central business district or a downtown. And it's called the Williams Tower. It's in the Galleria of Houston. It's 64 stories tall, 1.5 million square feet. So big building.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction into commercial real estate. And I always talk to people about this, and it's important for me because they have this training program. It's the assistant property manager training program. It takes about a year. It covers an extremely comprehensive list of real estate, topics. And so it'll talk about how buildings are financed, the investment side of it, what's the difference between a general partner and a limited partner. It talks about engineering systems, so how a chiller works with a cooling tower, an open loop and a closed loop. Talks about everything and anything you can imagine running a building. One of the topics is brokerage, leasing. So it talks about what type of leases there are. Is it triple net? Is it gross? Is it full service? A base year lease? And so really that was my first experience with leasing and brokerage was kind of through that training class. And then once I was done, I was managing that building, and the CBRE brokers that were leasing it were, top of the top, cream of the crop, great guys and girls. And so they would always ask me to accompany them on some of these leasing tours because, obviously I knew most about the building more than they did just because I ran it so well.
Sure.
And so they said, hey, would you come on this tour with me? So I said, yeah, I'd be happy to. So went on a couple tours, and one day, I'll never forget, his name's Dave Hanusa. He was one of the best brokers in Houston, pulled me aside and said, hey, would you ever be a broker? And I thought, well, I've seen the checks I got you guys on the property side. I mean, and the commissions are big. So, based on that, yeah, obviously it's attractive. And he said, well, if you are interested in doing it, do it before you have kids, because he knew I was married at the time. And he said, so do it before you have kids. Well, what he didn't know is my wife was pregnant with our first child. So I said, well, yeah, I'm not a dad yet, but let me think about it. And so I thought about it more and more. And I said, you know what, it is definitely something I'd like to get in eventually if the opportunity arises. So I started my real estate license training classes. I got my Texas real estate license a few months thereafter. And it's funny how God works in mysterious ways. I actually went to an industry golf tournament, and it had rained out. And so we played like 2 holes. And when it rained out, one of the vendors that invited me was like, hey, well, we're going to go across the street to this Mexican restaurant, have a couple margaritas. So why don't you join us? And I said, I'd love to. So we go there, and there happened to be a healthcare broker with Transwestern there. And so her and the vendor start speaking, and she's like, man, Heinrich is an outgoing personality. He's got a big personality, loves to just talk to everybody. He's outgoing. He should be a broker. So through that conversation, I got in touch with the Transwestern folks, and they recruited me to come on as kind of a junior broker for my first year or two, learn the tricks of the trade, learn the business, and then at that point, I was up and running. So 2 years at Hines, and then I went over to Transwestern, and that was the start of my brokerage career, specifically in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And so I can see where that kind of led to the transition to Carr, which we'll get to here in a second, but what were some of those things you learned early on as a listing agent, a landlord broker, that you think kind of helped position you as a true market expert and kind of get you to where you are now?
Yeah, honestly, so as a landlord representative, if I'm leasing a building for the landlord, they're going to come to me and they're going to say, hey, what do you think we can get for the space? Right. And this happens long before the building is even acquired by that landlord, because they're going to be going through the due diligence on the investment side. So they're going to ask an experienced broker in the field, hey, what do you think the rental rate's going to be? Because that's all going to impact the net operating income of the building, which is going to impact how much they can sell the building for eventually and how much they can pay back their investors. So one thing I learned is really understanding the market, knowing what the competition is, knowing what spaces are available out in the market. Because if you as a tenant broker came to me and said, hey, I have a primary care group who wants to lease in your building, I'm going to send you an LOI. I'm negotiating with you on that LOI. I, as a sophisticated landlord's agent and broker, I have to understand what my competition is. And I have to know all the second generation medical spaces in that submarket that's going to be competing with my building. I need to know what the rental rate is. I need to know generally what they're offering on a TI package and free rent concessions. So I think that to answer your question is what helped me the most was really being able to understand the holistic view of the market and knowing exactly what building had vacancies, what the rental rates were. Because at the end of the day, that was my competition. So the more you know about the competition, the better set you are to win the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I've been so impressed with you so far, is just like your depth of knowledge. For those of you who don't know, Heinrich led a couple of sessions for us about getting like a fast start. And then from a landlord perspective, which to me was the most impactful 30 minutes of the entire, conference, was just learning what landlords look for, what truly matters to them in a deal. And so having that background, it makes you just such a strong player now on the tenant buyer side. And so talk a little bit about when that transition started to happen. Like, was it gradual? Was it you just stumbled in the car and was like, hey, I want to pivot? Like, what was that transition like from a landlord agent over to the tenant buyer side with Carr?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I was dealing on the landlord side, obviously Carr has a good presence in Houston, and we're a national company, right? So we have agents and brokers in pretty much every single big city in the US. So I've always known about Carr. The reputation of Carr in the market is great. It's a great company. The agents and brokers that they hire are sophisticated, smart people, want to get deals done, care about their clients, and have a deep care about their clients. Not just some brokers that are out there trying to, earn a paycheck. Like, they truly do believe that they're fiduciaries to the clients. So I dealt with a couple of car brokers here in Houston on a few deals, and I just always liked the way that they did things. The processes were simplified to not overcomplicate the deal, because once you overcomplicate a deal, it just starts getting too convoluted and just withers away. So the fact that they were able to work with me on so many deals and really they understood that if we didn't meet in the middle of our negotiations, at the negotiating table, no one was going to get a deal done. The landlord wasn't going to be happy. The tenant wasn't going to be happy. So how do us as brokers, get to a place where we can all be happy, right? The landlord's making money. The tenant has an opportunity to be in a space that's going to serve their purpose. They're going to be able to see patients and, better lives for their patients. So really that's where I started working with Carr, and I just love the company. So over the years, I kept, asking some of these agents, what does it look like on the tenant side? What are the splits, that what does the company take as opposed to what do you take home? Because again, if you're a broker, those splits can vary different from firm to firm.
Absolutely.
Carr is very good at their splits, and I appreciate what they've done. So really, when I had the opportunity to go to the tenant side, I had to kind of sit back and look at it from a 30,000 foot level and think to myself, where can I make the most impact? I've been super successful representing landlords, national landlords that have hundreds of thousands of square feet of buildings, and I've created them hundreds of millions of dollars worth of value. And so that was fun and I enjoyed it, but I felt that my calling was to help the underdog, right? There were so many times where I would be on the landlord side and a physician would be unrepresented. They didn't have a broker on their side. And of course, my dad always told me to do the right thing, be a good person. So of course I gave the tenant a good deal. I always tried to give them the best deal that I could, but it was always better for the landlord because that was my fiduciary, right, and I had to make them money. That was my job. But there were so many times where I've left so many months of free rent on the table where I could have given it to the doctor. I just didn't. And there would be times where I'd give them a month or two of free rent and I could see their eyes just light up because that's real money that they were able to save and put back into the business, invest in their people, pay their employees more. A happy employee is a happy patient, right? Every time a patient comes into a physician's office and there's a new front desk girl or front desk guy or there's a new nurse, I mean, there's no consistency, right? So the patient's going to be like, well, now I have to explain myself to the next person because they weren't here last month, 2 months ago. So it all goes back down to the patient's experience. So if you can save that physician money to better their practice, to make their employees happier, the patient experience is going to be elevated and everybody's going to be happy. So, that's where I said, let me go to the tenant side because I know what these landlords want. I know what they want. I know what they'll negotiate on. I know what they'll give easily, what they won't give easily. So I was in a unique position to leverage my knowledge of the landlords, and not just from a perspective of what's the base rent, what's the TI, what's the OPEX, what's the free rent we can get, but really how the deal that I'm bringing them as a tenant rep broker is going to impact the valuation of the building, the net operating income, and eventually when they sell that building, are their investors going to be happy? And that's what a landlord wants, right? Landlords want, at the end of the day, they want their investors to be happy because they're going to buy more buildings and they're going to need more equity, right? And so if they do good on the first deal, well, guess what? Those investors are going to come back for the second one and the third one and the fourth one. And it gives them the opportunity to buy more buildings, make more money on the general partnership, which is what the landlord owners generally do, and everybody's happy. So knowing that and how the whole strategy is played out, it's easy for me to go to the landlord and say, look, I'll give you this, but I really need you to give me this. And then they generally do.
Yeah. I mean, that makes such sense, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a negotiation. It's a deal. Both parties are going to have concessions and things that they have to meet with in the middle. But if you can truly be meeting in the middle, even if it skews a little bit towards the tenant side, landlords are still going to be happy because their building is full. It's going to improve their NOI. It's going to improve their ability to, like you said, go back to the investors and secure more capital for future deals. But I think you kind of hinted at this, and it makes a great transition. You're a pro, man, at this podcast thing with a great transition there. But like, why is it risky for a tenant to go into these deals unrepresented? If they just call the number in the window and let's say they called you, Heinrich, about your building there in Houston, why is that a risky position to be in to start a deal?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just their lack of lack of knowledge. Physicians, their core competency is seeing patients, bettering patients' lives, helping people. That's what they're good at. And so for them to be unrepresented, it usually, not all the time, but usually means that they just don't understand the market. They don't understand what rents are. They don't understand what people are giving on free rent, concessions on TI. and a lot of other things. You just don't know what you don't know. You know, if someone came to me and said, "Hey, will you explain to me quantum physics?" I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not going to know. I can try to be. I tend to think I'm a very smart individual, but when it comes to that, I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. So someone can sincerely come to me and try to teach it to me, and ask me questions about it. But if I don't have a subject matter expert sitting next to me, I'm just not going to know what's true and what's not. The same goes for real estate. If I go to the physician and I say, "Hey, you know, I'm going to give you a great deal on the landlord side. I'll give you 2 months of free rent on a 10-year deal. I'm going to give you $30 a square foot on the shelf space. It's an amazing deal for you." If they don't have anybody advocating on their behalf, they're not going to know it's a good deal. You know, it could be a decent deal, but it's not going to be a great deal. And so they just don't understand the ins and outs of real estate. They don't understand what to look for in a lease agreement. They don't understand what to negotiate. For instance, you can negotiate, free reserve parking. They probably don't know that. You can negotiate a cap on controllable expenses. They don't know that. You can negotiate extremely advantageous language in the lease as it relates to landlord's default, right? And they don't know that. So there's so many things that they just don't know. And it's very important that a physician has that representation, because at the end of the day, like if the landlord has someone representing them, the tenants absolutely should have someone representing them. Oh, and by the way, landlords underwrite in their deals a commission for a tenant rep broker. If the physician doesn't use a broker, the landlord broker gets paid more. But at the end of the day, landlords enjoy working with brokers on the tenant side because it gets deal done quicker, and the probability of the deal getting done is much higher.
Yeah, exactly. And so you kind of hinted at it there, and I want to circle back to something you said earlier, not because I want you to repeat yourself, but because I think it's very important. Why is it not ideal to assume that a landlord broker is going to work on your behalf and get you a good deal? You kind of talked about it there a little bit, right? Like it would make sense for them to do that if they're getting the tenant and the listing agent commission from the baked in commission that's in the deal. But why is that not always advantageous for the doctors to just trust the listing broker to give them a good deal?
Simple answer is their fiduciary is totally different, right? Their fiduciary is to the landlord, not to the tenant. And so the fiduciary, they have to take care of the tenant to take care of the landlord. So what they're going to do is they're going to push rents as much as possible. You know, if I can increase if I can increase the rent on this space by $2 a square foot, and it's a 5,000 square foot tenant, you know, that's a lot of money at the end of the day that landlord's going to see on a 10-year deal. The tenant might think, okay, this is a normal rate, but it's really not, right? It's an above market rate. And so that's when the landlord's broker is going to be more, obviously on the landlord side, trying to make the deal a lot sweeter for the landlords, because obviously, you know, economics is going to change the deal and how it's underwritten and how it performs. So really, it just goes back to, you know, the landlord's broker is always going to make the deal sweet for the landlord and not for the tenant. It might be somewhat good for the tenant, but it's never going to be great.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point, is the fiduciary responsibility lies with the landlord. And so they are legally obligated to get them as good of a deal as possible. There are some baked in concessions that they can get, but they're not going to get the max concessions that are out there that, you know, as the listing broker are there, but you have to kind of keep some of that close to the vest because the landlord wants to maximize their space. And there's, you know, we're not sitting here. I want to be clear. We're not like painting the landlord as the bad guys, Bowser and Mario or anything like that, right? Like they're just good business people. They're good business people. They're maximizing their investments, and they're very savvy. And yet they're very savvy business men and women, but yet they also have proper representation. Like very rarely does a savvy landlord who owns multiple properties, has the backing of maybe some private equity or a REIT or something like that, very rarely are they doing those negotiations themselves. Yes, they're approving them and signing off on them, but they have a listing agent that handles that for them. Am I speaking out of turn with that, or is that what you see?
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah. I mean, every sophisticated landlord hires a brokerage firm to get their buildings filled up.
Yeah, and so you see it like these mom and pops that own like one or two properties. They may not, but a true savvy one does. And so if somebody who does dozens of these deals every year hires representation, why shouldn't the medical providers who might be doing one every 5 to 10 or 15 years, why would they not have representation for what is the second highest line item on their P&L behind their staff?
Yeah, you're right. It's very important for physicians. I mean, for all tenants, it's not just physicians. I mean, every single tenant, whether you're a coffee shop or a Fortune 500 tech company, every tenant should have representation because,
Yep.
again, if the landlord's going to have representation fighting for the landlord's interests, there should be someone on the opposite side of the table fighting for the tenant's interests.
Yep, exactly. And that kind of
You're
parlays
right.
into our next.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're right. I mean, landlords. I'm still friends with many landlords. They call me once a month, asking me how I'm doing. I mean, they know my family, so they're good people. They always call me and say, "Hey, can you bring me a tenant?" Because they know now I'm on the tenant side.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they're good people. But again, it just goes back to they have investors that they have to make happy, and that's the name of the game, is making the investors happy. And again, like you said, they're savvy business people. Doesn't make them bad people. They know what they want, and they're gonna hire the best people to make sure that they achieve their goals.
Exactly. And humble brag, whatever, but just in my short dealings here with the landlords here in Memphis, I've made some pretty good friendships that I have some of them call and they're asking me, hey, like, I've got this tenant, they're thinking about this space, like, what are you seeing out in the market from concessions? And just having like general conversations, because we've got a good working relationship. These negotiations aren't meant to get hostile and like us versus them, Mike Tyson, Joe Frazier type fight. Like, it's just it's a business deal. And at the end of the day, if you do a good job, you're respectful of both parties, and you have high integrity in what you do, that's going to be a great landlord tenant buyer relationship, to where in the future you're going to be able to get even better deals, and it's going to be easier to get to that because they understand what we're about on the tenant side. We're not out trying to paint them as a bad guy and and run them out of their building. We're just trying to get them a quality tenant, but with the best rates that we can. And so you should walk away from the negotiation table with a good working relationship. It's only going to make you, as a tenant buyer, your life easier in the future.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. It's a great point. It's definitely not us versus them. And I had this mentality when I was young in my broker's career. I said, man, I'm gonna stick it to this tenant's representative, or I'm gonna make so much money for this landlord. And it was always me versus them. And the one day I had a conversation with someone, I don't even remember what it was, but a little light bulb went on, and I said, it's not me versus them. We're all on the same team. Like I said earlier in the podcast, like, we all want to get a deal done. And the sooner that you realize that we're working with the other side of the table, that's when things really started taking off for me, because I became collaborative. I became maybe easier to deal with on a broker side. It wasn't, it's my way or the highway, and if you don't like it, then go to the building next door. It was like, well, how do we make a deal happen? What do you need? Tell me what you need, and I'll fight for you to get that done. And so that's, again, I think why the brokers at Carr, when I was on the landlord side, had such a positive impact on me. It's just, they were so collaborative, and they were great people, and they just said, listen, this is what we want, and I know this is what you want, so let's get a deal done.
Yeah, it's firm but fair, right? You can be firm but fair and understand what the deal looks like and how to get a deal done, and that doesn't have to be hostile. And I think, if you don't take anything else away from this, if you're working with an agent that it becomes like that gruff kind of like contentious negotiation, you may want to back off a little bit and hear that. But again, great transition once again as we look at what makes a strong offer, right? So we found the properties that we like. We're starting to talk about what that's going to look like. Not asking for like specific dollar and down to the dollar and cents, but as a landlord rep, what are you looking for in a strong offer to start the conversation?
Yeah, I think honestly, really, if the tenant is willing to pay the base rent, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, base rent, and what the landlord wants is they want their NOI to either meet or exceed what they underwrote when they acquired the asset. So if a tenant comes to me when I was on the landlord side and they say, hey, we want, let's just hypothetically say the base rent's $20 a square foot is what I'm quoting. If they came to me and they said, we're going to pay 15, I mean, that's just not feasible. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not that we don't want to get the deal done. It's just that if we do a deal at $15 a square foot, our NOI, the net operating income of that building, is going to be severely impacted. It's going to lessen the total money that building generates every single year. And that is going to essentially negatively impact and affect the cap rate of which you would sell. So not to get too much into the weeds, but the higher the NOI, the lower the cap rate, and the more expensive the building is going to be at the sale, which means the landlord is going to make more money. So when someone comes to me and says, hey, I'll pay your base rent. You're asking $20 a square foot. I'll pay $20. It's a little more than what we want to pay, but we need to bridge that gap with free rent or concessions or something along those lines. If someone came to me and told me that, I'd say that's a good start. If you're willing to pay the rate, pay the fare, now we can start really negotiating. And then it comes back to, well, let me give you 3 months of free rent on the first year to bring down your net effective rent to where it's closer to that $15 a square foot. And so there's a lot of ways to obviously go about it, but really the biggest thing is when you negotiate with a landlord, what the landlord agents want to see is the face rate and the base rent being met.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where having kind of coming full circle again, a strong tenant buyer rep comes in handy to where you can explain, yes, we're not getting the $15 a foot that you're looking for. It's going to be closer to 24, but they're willing to offset that by giving you 5, 6, 7 months of free rent on the front end. They're going to cut you a check to help with your build out expenses. And so having a savvy tenant rep that has some tools to show you that on a spreadsheet that can put it into an actual mathematic formulation and say, hey, look, this is what your first year is going to cost. It's exactly what you're looking for. It's just structured differently so that it's a win-win on both sides.
Exactly. And, and again, like a landlord's not going to it's not going to charge an out of market rent.
Right.
It goes back to what I said earlier. Before they even buy the building, they're going to go to their broker, which if they're new to market, they're probably going to pick some broker's brains. But if they have numerous buildings in the Houston market and I lease 5 of them and they're going to buy another one, they're going to call me and say, what do you think about this market? What's the market rent? And so they're never going to throw a rent out there and ask for 25 when the market is 20, because they know they're not going to achieve that. And then they're going to disappoint the investors. So at the end of the day, they're looking at it from a realistic perspective. And so when someone's asking you for X amount of dollars on the base rent, it's usually in market. It might be a little elevated due to some other things. They might throw extra TI at the deal if there's shelf space, right? Instead of giving 70, they might give 90 or 95, and that rent's going to be a little bit higher because they got to amortize that additional TI into the rate. Their building might have a deli downstairs, which the other buildings don't. They might have a nice restaurant downstairs. So there's things that impact the base rate, but at the same time, they're not going to be exorbitant or exponentially higher than other buildings.
Well, same thing if you're looking at like an older building, they may have a bigger load factor, like a common area, because newer buildings aren't having that as much. But older buildings built in the 70s and 80s had these massive lobbies. I looked at one a couple of weeks ago here in Tennessee for a client that had this giant lobby, and actually 2 of them because they had it was slanted ground, so they had a big lobby on the backside and their load factor was like 25% because it's just so much like extra space in there. And so you have to understand the market and understand the buildings that you're looking at to understand why the base rates, the OpEx and all those things are what they are. Because most of the operating costs, we're getting in the weeds a little bit of like a triple net or something like that. The pass-throughs are just that. They're pass-throughs. It's something that can't necessarily be controlled. And so maybe there is a little wiggle room on the base rent when those OpExs might be a little bit higher.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I'm actually doing a deal right now where the OpEx is, almost $20 a square foot. Wow. It's crazy. And that's like a 30,000 square foot building. So on that sense, they want a certain face rate. And I said, guys, I understand you want this, but you're not going to achieve it because physicians don't care about, base rent and OpEx. They look at a total gross operating cost and what is it going to cost to be in that space. Yeah. And if the market is 40 and it's 20 and 20 or 25 and 15 on base rate and OpEx, if you're at 43, 44 because of your operating expenses, well, guess what? You're not going to get with deals won. No one's going to come to your building unless you reduce that face rate and the base rental rate. So we're actually doing a deal right now where I said, look, OpEx is $2 to $3 higher at this building than any other building in the market. So I need a $2 to $3 rental discount. And again, it depends. If it's an extremely competitive market, the landlord's not going to take that deal. But this landlord's actually willing to do that. So we're going to get a pretty strong deal on the table here for one of our clients.
That's awesome. I want to talk about something that comes up a lot. Maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. I've seen a lot of my negotiations. Everybody wants to talk about lease term. I've had several come up to me early on and be like, look, I just want to sign like a 3-year lease. And if I like being there, then I'll sign a 10-year. Why is that not necessarily the best place starting out?
Yeah, so you don't get any concessions on a 3-year deal. Most landlords will just give you the space as is, right? So if it's a second generation space and it literally works perfect for you. Maybe the landlord will do a 3-year deal. It's going to be a little bit higher face rate because it's a short-term lease, essentially. So, for the landlords, they don't like short-term leases, because if they ever sell the building, one of the things that impacts the cap rate is going to be it's a WALT. It's a weighted average lease term. Buildings with long weighted average lease terms sell for a lot higher because they have that guaranteed income for the next 5, 6, 7 years. If a weighted average lease term is 2 to 3 years, the person who's going to be buying that building, or the group that's going to be buying that building, understands that, hey, in 2 years, I'm going to have to start negotiating, getting these leases, either release the space to someone else or renew these tenants in place. I'm going to pay commissions. I'm going to pay TIs. So it's a bigger investment for those types of investors. So landlords generally hate 3-year deals. They want to do 5, 7, or 10, or somewhere in between. And for the tenant side, oftentimes I'll work with tenants and they'll say, oh yeah, it's shell space and we want to build it out. And I'd say that's fine, but just know on a 5-year deal, the landlord's not going to give you much TI, tenant improvement allowance. On a 10-year deal, they will. And the last thing you want is, let's hypothetically say this tenant's like, look, I can only do a 5-year deal. My contract with the state or with this physician group or whatever the case is only 4 or 5 years. So I can't do anything beyond that because now I'm open to risk. And I'd say, okay, that's fine. Then we'll, do a termination clause at year 5 with certain stipulations that we can, exercise as a tenant. One might be if our contract with, the state, for instance, doesn't get renewed, then the landlord will allow us to terminate that lease. But the biggest risk is if we spend, $100, $150 a square foot to build out that space, and the tenant after 4 or 5 years says, well, I don't want to renew you. Thanks for building out this beautiful space and spending all this money on it. I'm going to lease it out now to Joe down the street for $5 more a square foot. Then you're just spent all this money, sunk so much capital into the deal, and you're not going to get anything back for it. So if it's a shell space, I use that analogy and that argument because it opens the doctor and the physician up to a lot of risk. And also the lending side, they're going to most likely lend money. So the term of the lease has to match the loan, term of the loan. So there's certain things that there's just not negotiable on the lending side. But really, if the doctor's well capitalized and wants to do a 5-year or 3-year deal, I always try to push them to 5, just because 3, there's just no real bang for your buck as a tenant.
Yeah, that's the conversation I'm having too. And from the other side of it, like, okay, let's say we do miraculously get this 3-year deal. In 3 years, that rate's not going to drop, but just because you're giving them a longer term, they're going to stay close to where you're finishing. So you're not going to get as good of a deal for the longer term of the lease, because you've already kind of set a standard that may be a bit higher. Maybe the landlord did go a bit higher because it was a 3-year lease. They're not going to then go back to that original rate because they've already put some investment in there. They're invested in it. Now the landlord has the leverage, and all these negotiations are about creating leverage. You've surrendered that leverage, and now you're basically more or less at the mercy of what they want to charge for that longer lease.
Yeah. And another thing, oftentimes rental rates, I saw this after COVID. We were quoting in one market, 22, 23 bucks a square foot. After COVID, we went to 28. And there were certain factors that kind of led us to bump the rate to 27, 28, but we got $5 more a square foot. If that tenant let's say in 2020 signed a deal and it was 22 bucks a square foot, with 3% annual increases, it's about 50, 60 cents a year. So you're looking at $24 or so, at the expiration of that 3-year deal. If they were in a 10-year deal, they would have been locked at a below market rent for 10 years. But now, because they only did a 3-year deal and have to renew, the lender's going to say, well, I'm doing deals at 27 and 28, so that's what you're going to be paying. So they're going to just they're going to have such a huge rent increase. And so it's advantageous because it just gives the practice, the foresight into future economics to be able to budget better and be more profitable.
Yeah, exactly. And so as we start to talk about deals, actual deals, like structuring deals to win some of these, we just talked about lease term. What do you see? Like, Houston feels like a pretty competitive market. In Memphis, we've got a bit of a surplus of spaces. So it's it's kind of a tenant's market right now, because you can kind of get a few landlords competing for your business because we have some spaces available. What does it look like in a more competitive market when you're trying to structure a deal to win, to get the landlord's attention when maybe there's not as much space and you're trying to be the one to win that deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Houston is pretty competitive in most of the markets. There's some markets that just have a lot of vacancy, but the markets that everybody wants to be in obviously is very competitive. So if you want to win a deal on the tenant side, number one, you just have to go in at what they're asking, because like I mentioned earlier, if I open up that proposal on the landlord side and I see a rental discount of $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 a square foot, I'm just going to say we're so far away from getting a deal done. I don't even want to respond because I know next month I'll get an inquiry and they're going to pay the face rate. So the biggest thing is you have to go in and essentially agree to pay the base rate. What they're asking, don't argue with that. Say, look, I understand it's a competitive market, and you're obviously going to do your homework. So you're going to know that the rate is similar in that market to other area or to other buildings and assets. So really just getting the face rate and agreeing to that. And then again, not overcomplicating the deal. We know that, especially in retail now here in Houston, it's super competitive where if you submit an LOI with 2 months or 3 months of free rent, they're going to kick it back and they're going to say, we're not giving you any free rent because that's how competitive it is. So I think at the end of the day, winning a deal it's kind of two avenues you have to go down. One, agreeing to a lot of what the landlord wants, because at the end of the day, they have the leverage, they have the cards, it's their building, they're going to get what they want. And two, being able to talk to your client and making sure that they understand the expectations. If we go into a market and I tell my clients, oh yeah, it's $40 or $45 a square foot in rent, we're going to get it for 38, 37. We're going to get 3 or 4 months of free rent. We're going to get $30 a square foot in TI. In retail, that just doesn't happen. And so you have to set the expectations, because if you don't and you come back with a deal that's pretty much what the landlord wants and it's very far from what you promised your client, they're going to be unhappy and they're going to be mad at you, and you're most likely going to get fired. So it's very important that you set the expectations. And if you tour them through 5 or 6 properties and it's all very similar, they're going to understand it's a tight market, and this is what we're going to have to deal with. So again, like touring properties, making sure they're understanding the market the best they can, but also really just setting the expectations. I think that's going to get you to win a deal. And there's certain other things you can kind of negotiate, but if it's a landlord's market, man, you play by their rules. And I hate to admit it now that I'm on the tenant side, but it's that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in light of that, when we're going in and we're talking to these landlords, be it competitive, maybe even not a competitive market, what are some kind of guidelines for when you should push to try and get your way, or when a client or a tenant should stay a bit more flexible to make sure that the deal gets done and we don't have the landlord walking away from the table?
Yeah, again, it just goes back to market knowledge. If you have 2 to 3 really good options, and that could happen in a tight market. They can be 4 medical office buildings, each one has a 2,000 square foot vacancy that's plug and play ready. At that point, you can go to the landlord and say, look, as the landlord's broker, that there's this space down the road that's 2,000 square feet, and this one opposite the highway that's 2,000 square feet. They're vacant. What they're asking. They're giving us a good deal. And so you have a little bit more leverage on that front when you have 2 to 3 good options. At that point, I would then push and say, well, this landlord's giving me this and this landlord's giving me this. So why don't we come back to you, Mr. Landlord, where we really want to be, and sweeten the deal a little bit more, and we can get a deal done. If it's a market that there's just no vacancy, there's just really no room for negotiations. At that point, again, it just goes back to the expectations and setting the expectations with your client and saying, there's just not much, And I'll give you a quick example. I'm representing a friend of mine. He's a personal trainer. He's doing so well. Every single day he's got, clients that are just from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. every single day out of his garage.
Awesome.
So he's like, Heinrich, I need a space. Can you help me? So I said, yeah, where do you want to be? He said, I want to be 3 blocks from my house. There's this one building, and it's in a little part of town called Montrose. And Montrose is just jam-packed, no developments. Retail's blowing up, but when it relates to like a flex warehouse space, there's just not much, because he wants that warehousey gym feel.
Yeah, sure.
So I found him a building, and it's a really nice building, but it's the only one in that entire market. And so, and they're, quoting $40 a square foot. And I told him, I said, look, this is it. I'll fight for you, and I'm going to try to get you the best deal that I can. I'll try to get you as much TI and free rent, but this is the rate. They're not going to deviate. So are you okay with this rate? And he said, yes, I'm okay with it. And I said, all right. And I think this is where we're going to land, but I'm going to push really hard to get you what you want. But just know that this is kind of where it's going to land. and just because there's no other option, right? So, and if you set the expectation of your client, they're going to say, okay, I understand. So, I'm willing to take this deal because that's where he wants to be. And at the end of the day, you kind of have to sacrifice a little bit of the economics if you're checking
Yeah.
every single other box in geography, location, where you want to be, demographics, all those types of things. So it's not all just deal economics. There's a lot of intangibles that goes into a deal. But yeah, so that's a pretty good example of we just can't push back on much. So let's just get a deal done.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I had a dentist. I actually posted about this on LinkedIn not all that long ago, where they came to me and they were like, "We've got to be out of this space. Like, our rent is going up by 30% because we're going month to month. We don't want to stay here because it's too much space. My partner's retiring, and I really like this one space. I've already talked to the landlord. I know what the deal looks like." And it's like, all right, know that now you've kind of tipped our hand a little bit. They know what we need. They know we're in a bind. They know they have the upper hand. And so just understand, like, this is what they're asking. This is probably where we're going to land. I'm going to push to get it cheaper. And we ended up getting some free rent and some other things. We landed pretty close to that asking base rate, which was competitive. I'm not saying they blew it up, but it's all about leverage. That was the only building that was like what he was looking for. And my client had already kind of tipped his hand, like, this is the space that I have to have. And so it's about creating a posture, knowing then you have to be flexible with what they offer, because that's, you're going to get what they offer. The landlord has the upper hand there.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, if your client tells you explicitly, this is where I want to be, you've got to be very sensitive to that, because what you don't want to do as a tenant broker is push, upset the landlord. And then the landlord's like, you know what, I just don't want to do this deal. And then they turn you away. And now you've lost the space where your client really wants to be. So you have to have great social awareness or situational awareness to know when to push and when not to push. And I think that's where good brokers really earn their creator value for their tenants, and is really just knowing when to push and knowing when to back off. Because the last thing that you want to do as a broker is lose that space with your client that really wants that space.
Yep, exactly. Man, again, I really appreciate the time today. As we start to land this plane, I got a couple of rapid fire kind of big picture questions I want to throw at you before we get out of here. The first one, what is the best leverage a tenant can have? What's the best leverage?
Oh man, it's time. I know we say it time and time again, but it's honestly time. The more time you have, just the stronger the deal is going to be for you. There were so many times on the landlord side, I wouldn't reach out to a tenant for, if they sign a 5-year deal and 4.5 years later on, I still wouldn't reach out to them. I'd call them a month before expiration. Now, I'd always put feelers out there to kind of figure out if they were going to renew or not. But if they called me and started the process, I'd always kind of delay it a little bit. But really, time is the biggest thing.
Yeah, for sure. What is one clause that gets overlooked sometimes, or maybe one concession, either way, that tenants overlook that could help them get a better deal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think everything's negotiable, and I think a lot of times brokers think within the confines of like a square box, right? They know, I can negotiate base rent to a certain degree. I can negotiate tenant improvement allowance. I can get free rent. But there's so many other things that's negotiable, right? There's no set of rules that says you can negotiate this and you cannot negotiate this. So at the end of the day, everything is negotiable, right? It's like that that saying that says everything's for sale at the right price, right? So at the end of the day, there's so many things you can negotiate. Like if you're looking at an office building in a downtown area, you can negotiate free parking, right, for the first year or two. You can negotiate so many different things, right? You can negotiate free overtime air. Overtime is something a lot of people don't understand and they overlook it. Obviously, if you have your own HVAC unit feeding the premises and you're paying for your own utilities, you can run that system however long you want, up until midnight or whatever the case may be. But if you're in an office building that has a building automation system that runs the entire building on different zones, you have to have the landlord or the property management keep that zone on for you after building hours. And so one thing that we can negotiate is free or a reduced cost of overtime air. And it's expensive. It's usually about $75 per hour. So if you're doing that 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's what, $225 a day. 5 days, that's over $1,000 a week. So it's expensive. So those are things that you can negotiate. But as it results to in the lease, one clause that you shouldn't overlook is the default on the landlord side, because I have had a couple of clients now that the landlord has just not taken care of what they need to take care of, and their default language was just advantageous to the landlord and so detrimental to the tenant, and their business has really suffered. So I'd always say if there is a default on the landlord, make sure that the attorney looks at it, because obviously we cannot redline leases as it relates to those types of things. And that's why it's important to have a real estate attorney on your behalf as well. But yeah, just you have to look at the whole lease and understand how things impact you on a practical basis.
Yeah. What about a negotiation tactic that you see that's often a bit overrated, or things that made you chuckle as a landlord agent?
Honestly, it's saying that there's like a cheaper option elsewhere. I'd get a lot of tenant rep brokers that come in there and say, well, this is expensive, or operating expenses are high. And then I'd ask them like, okay, well, have you gone out to like look at the market? And they always say yes. And then I always say, okay, well, show me. And then they all of a sudden they're like, well, maybe it's not that high, right? So I think one tactic that's comical is when they start throwing out these statements of fact, at least of fact on their behalf, and they say this is high and this is high and this is ridiculous, this isn't market. So I think just making demands that truly are not true. I think that's kind of a tactic that I chuckle at.
Yeah, to drive that point home a bit further, I recently was working with a landlord agent, and I offered kind of a bit higher, asked for a bit higher TI package, and he was like, "I feel like this is high for their use," and I was like, "Well, this is what they do in the space. This is what they need. This is why that's what it is." Then he said, obviously I'll run it up the chain. Well, then it took a couple of days and he came back and he called me and he was like, well, I did my homework. I went in the space. One of his other locations saw it. And I was like, oh, so you do your homework. And he was like, yeah. So, I mean, it is a competitive. So they came back a little bit less, but pretty close to what I'd asked for, because he went and did his homework. And it impressed me that like he took my offer, went to understand, like I told him why, but then he went a little bit further to fully understand it. And it got a really good free rent, or a tenant allowance pitch back from the landlord because he went and saw the space. So just know they're doing their homework as well on the other side of the table.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You have to make sure that the landlord understands your client and understands who your client is, because at the end of the day, they're essentially giving us like a loan, right? I know that we're paying them, but they're giving us the space to be able to practice and to make money and to change people's lives and to do what we need to do. So at the end of the day, the more ammo you can take and give to the landlord's broker, that landlord's broker is hopefully sophisticated enough to convey that message to the landlord and get the landlord comfortable with the use and the client and the tenant, they're going to throw money at the deal. If I came to you and I said, hey, I have a ABA therapy group that's looking for 5,000 square feet. This is what we want to do. And you go to the landlord and you say, oh, landlord, it's a 5,000 square foot ABA group. They're going to go, okay, so are they creditworthy? Is this their first location? But if I come to you and say, oh, they have 25, 30 locations across Texas, they're very well capitalized, they have 3 other clinics in this kind of submarket, they're looking to see more kids. If you take that to the landlord and then I give you my LOI and it's an aggressive LOI, your landlord is going to say, okay, it's an aggressive LOI, but the default rate is going to be super low. So I understand the risk on my behalf of giving TI or free rent, but I know it's a good tenant and they're going to be there for the long term.
Yeah, that's huge, man. Like being able to talk to the listing agents before you submit an offer, that's something you should look for in a savvy tenant rep for sure. Is that I always call the listing agent before I submit the LOI. I always say, hey, here's what I'm asking for. Here's why. Here's what we need. And kind of spell out exactly what we're asking, because you can speak to this, Heinrich. You're going to go back to the landlord and fight for us because it's a good use. I gave you the reasons why. And if I'm not giving that information, then it's just another deal coming across the landlord's table. And so I'll always try and call the listing agent first, and then I'll summarize it in the email as well. Here, reminder, here's what we talked about. This is why we're asking. So then he has ammo when he goes to the landlord to say, hey, this is why this would be a good deal for you with this client.
Yeah, I had a primary care doctor reach out to me. He didn't like the building he was in. His lease didn't expire for 1.5 years. But he's like, man, I really want to get out of this building, see what you can do for me. And so I was able to negotiate a deal at another building, get him essentially 6 months from once we signed the lease to rent commencement. And then I got him 1 year of free rent. So I got him 18 months, and I bridged that gap from when he wanted to sign the lease. Because obviously, if we waited a year, that space probably would have been gone. So I was able to get him a lease, a 10-year lease, and he wanted to be in the building. But again, I saved him of paying rent twice in 2 different buildings. And so but again, I went to the landlord and I was like, this is why we're asking for this crazy offer. It's because he's not expiring until next year. It was like in November I did this deal, and he wasn't expiring until May or June of 2027. And so we got him a great deal. I was super happy. But again, the landlords just have to know why you're asking for what you're asking for.
That's it. That's exactly right. Well, hey, man, I really appreciate the time today, Heinrich. This is a lot of fun. I know I learned a lot after our national meeting. I couldn't wait to do this episode because I knew I learned a ton. I knew that this was only going to be that much more impactful for me and our clients and those out there considering starting their own practice. So again, Heinrich, thank you for your time today, man. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Love paying it forward. But yeah, it's been fun, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, for sure. Well, hey, listen, I'm going to put Heinrich's LinkedIn information in the show description below. You can always use the Find an Agent link that I have down there as well. If you have any needs in Texas, Heinrich, especially in the Houston area, Heinrich is your guy. But that Find an Agent link finds you a Carr agent wherever you are and wherever you're looking to open your practice. And it would be wise to click that because we've got great guys like Heinrich within our company that have that experience to help you set up deals that you can go and then win the space that you want. But again, I am Rusty. This is Heinrich. We appreciate you joining us today on another episode of Coffee and Contracts. Y'all go be a friend of somebody who needs a friend, and we'll see you back here next time.